correct?
Yep, that'd be great.
Excellent. Excellent. So good afternoon. So I'm Jim Winship. I teach social work at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I do some training and other kinds of support services for the Salvation Army Social Services. And this is a really good thing to be thinking about, because issues around boundaries and ethics are always with us. It's a huge area. And so the focus of this webinar is going to be the following things. One, we're going to talk about dual relationships, situations in which the worker knows or is acquainted with a client in more than one way. We're going to look at the boundary issues between workers and clients that happen not only in relation to dual relationships, but there's some other boundary issues that are important. We're also going to look at the impact of social media and newer communication technologies in terms of dual relationships, in terms of boundaries, and just in terms of privacy issues. And then finally, and this may be the most important part, is we're going to look at some situations and some issues. Rachel had sent out an email to people who were registered for this webinar a week or so ago, asking for situations, scenarios, times when it was unclear exactly what one should do in situations related to these issues. And she got some responses. I pulled some responses from just my own background. And so we'll look at those, and those are some of the times in which we'll be asking you to type into the text box your responses. Rachel and I were originally thinking about trying to do these as multiple choice and sending them out in advance to see what people would say. The disadvantage of that is that we wouldn't learn anything new. In that,
Dr. Winship,
yes.
Your presentation isn't up, it's just your desktop. Is that how you want it right now, or did you want your slides up?
Are my slides showing?
No, it's just your desktop.
Wow. This is something that hasn't happened before. So now are you seeing the slides? You're seeing the
Mm-mm. We see like your desktop and then an open drive. PowerPoint doesn't appear to be launched.
Okay, so let's go back to this. Interesting. So this says show my screen. Now, are you seeing the mouse? You seeing the cursor go round and round? Okay.
Yep, it's just your PowerPoint presentation isn't up. It's just your desktop.
Yeah, but now do you see the PowerPoint?
Yep, now we're seeing it. So you just have to hit launch
now,
that.
let me launch it again and then see, because I'm not sure exactly what that was. Okay. Now do you see the PowerPoint?
Yep, everything's good now.
Good, good, good. So we're back to this, and so one, we want you to, when we do those, we want you to respond to those, and then also if there are things that occur to you in terms of issues, things that you just never got around to sending to Rachel after you got the email, please send those to her, and then she can introduce those as well. So if we look at dual and multiple relationships, and I'm pulling some of this material from the National Association of Social Workers. I'm a social worker, and they've done good work on this. I will also get to Rachel, and she'll send out with the PowerPoint a bibliography of resources, all of which are available, almost all of which are available online. So if people want to read more on these, that there's some more information that you can get. So what the National Association of Social Workers talks about is that, that dual or multiple relationships occur when professionals, or essentially or workers, assume two or more roles at the same time or sequentially with a client, such as assuming more than one professional role or blending of professional and non-professional relationships. We'll get into sequential later because that's a really interesting situation. So when we look at the reality of dual relationships, and the most recent Code of Ethics came up with this piece. Instances when dual and multiple relationships are unavoidable, social workers should take steps to protect clients and are responsible for setting clear, appropriate, and culturally sensitive boundaries. I used to be very involved with the National Rural Social Work Organization, And when this code of ethics was when the revision of the code of ethics was being proposed, there were people who were saying, you know, absolutely no dual relationships. You should not know people more than one way. And what members of my organization, of that organization, said, that's not the reality in rural America. You know, we often know people 2 or 3 different ways. That's really thought from the point of view of clinical social workers who do therapy and have a clinical therapeutic relationship with a client. Dual relationships, multiple relationships just happen. But what we need to do is we need to protect clients, we need to set boundaries, but we also need to protect ourselves and we need to protect the organization. And so I'll touch on all of those as we go through this. There's a couple of phrases, terms, that I think are really important, because when we talk about boundaries, by nature it seems that this is something, and crossing boundaries, and that this is something wrong. And one of the terms, and I can't remember who first came up with this, is boundary crossing. And that definition is when boundary crossing, when a worker is involved in a dual relationship with a client or colleague that's not intentionally exploitative, manipulative, deceptive, or coercive. So in ways in which you know somebody more than one way, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The question is there an intent to benefit in some way or to harm somebody in one way? And one example of a boundary crossing that that I use, and I use very purposefully, I use in my teaching, I use when I used to do a lot of work with parents and with families, is the sharing of personal information. Now, I do that very, very, very purposefully. And I joke that, sort of joke, but I think it's the reality, is that I stopped working with doing parent groups, parent classes, a number of things, working with homeless parents, really at the point when my kids grew up. And I no longer could share current stories about being upset with something my child had done 2 days before, or talking about something that went at home, because in those situations I was often one of the few males in a group, more educated, more stable in many ways in my life. Lots of things that weren't in common with the clients. And so very, very purposefully sharing small bits of information about interactions with my family I found were useful. I do the same kinds of things in my teaching. And because it's nothing that would reverberate negatively on the family members, and it's not exploitative, manipulative, deceptive, or coercive. And then there's also just times in which you just happen to be somebody that you happen to be there are other relationships, and those are gray areas, and I'll come to that in just a minute. And that's different than boundary violations. And there are 4 of those that I put up here, and I put them all at one time because there's a way in which some of those may be intersecting. But the one that we talk about most often is intimate relationships where there's some physical sexual contact or a sexual relationship. The only student in the social work program at UW-Whitewater where I teach that we've dismissed out of hand in at least the last 20 years, time that I've been there, has been a student who was dating a client. She was doing a social work internship in a setting with individuals with some physical disabilities, and the supervisor found out that she had a relationship with one of the clients, and so the internship was terminated immediately. And we checked with our UW system attorney, and he said, yes, you can terminate the students belonging to the social work, getting a social work major, getting a social work degree. The intimate relationships is the thou shalt not. And that's often what people think of in terms of boundaries, but there are a number of other ones that also can be detrimental to clients and then also to the organization. And one of those has to do with personal benefit, providing services for the worker. There were cases, and one of those came up to the licensing board in which a client had volunteered to clean the worker's house because she knew the worker was so busy, and the worker agreed to that. In which is the thou shalt not. There should not be something in which the client is doing something for the worker because there really is some expectation that there is something for something. It's a boundary violation when as workers we give gifts or services not available to other clients. And that's not talking about some clients receive services that other clients don't receive, and organizations do that just by the nature. We have limited resources. Sometimes we're making decisions on where's it going to do the most good, where's it going to make, where it can be an impact. I'll make at least one other reference to a nonprofit, Bethel House, an ecumenical program for homeless families, where I've been on the board since its inception, and I do consultation for the case manager, a bachelor's level social worker who does case manager. And occasionally we will have vehicles that are donated that we can give to clients, or in a couple of cases former clients. And obviously we don't have a car for everybody who's got a car that doesn't work or doesn't work well, which is essentially all of our clients. That's not talking about that. We're not talking about that, deciding how to divvy up, how to dispense limited resources. We're talking about giving some kind of service to clients because you just happen to like them. This sounds a little weird, but I realize I've got a what's the word I want? Almost a positive stereotype toward tall people. I'm over 6'4", and I meet somebody, and it's somebody that's at eye level, or I don't have to sit on a table to talk to, and I kind of like that. And I remember when I was working with homeless families that there was one of the moms there with a couple of kids, and she was in recovery and doing real well, and I was thinking about, boy, she's really doing well, and then thinking, how can we help us? Okay, is part of it the fact that she's 6 feet tall? Essentially the same height as my daughter, and so we need to be careful about that. And then obviously it's a boundary violation when we give money out of our own pocket directly to a client. There are situations in which money can be funded very indirectly and anonymously to help families or individuals, but that's not what we're talking about. And then the last one of those is purposefully socializing with clients. There may be times in which one is in social situations with clients just by the nature of small town or rural life or working in a neighborhood, but that's different than making plans to go out with somebody who is, or spend time with somebody who's a current client. So those are major boundary violations. There are other gray areas where it's just not that clear. And one of those is social and community events. Now, I'm going back at this point and really talking about when I was doing groups with parents at a shelter in the southern part of Walworth County, in Darien, for those who know the area. So it was a family shelter where people could be there for 90 days. And occasionally there would be people there that I knew, especially because our kids were young then. And so I would go to an event and I would see both a former and a current client who were there. And it just kind of happens. How we deal with that, we'll talk about a little bit. There are clients, and again in small towns and rural areas, where there are mutual acquaintances. So if you grew up in that town, you may have gone to high school with a brother or sister of a client who comes in. You don't really know them, but you know who they are, and you know this is Emily's sister. And there are just other unavoidable situations, including running into clients in public spaces. So you're at the bank, you're at the grocery store, you're someplace else, and you see someone that you've seen earlier in the week when you were in your case management role. And then the question, how do we deal with that? And I've got a scenario or two of that. So some of those are the issues of thinking about workers in their roles or individuals in the roles of workers, in their roles in families, and their other roles in the community, and how those intersect or don't with individuals who are clients or who are being helped by the Army. But there's another situation, and that is the issue of clients that have become attached to us or who just don't get professional relationships, and who really are described as needy, but people who just really want either a lot of our time or a lot of our time and a relationship that's not the kind of professional helping relationship that we strive to have. So that includes people who have burned their bridges, they've borrowed money or done and not paid it back, or done other stuff to where their family doesn't want anything to do with them, their friends don't want anything to do with them, and really the only quote relationship they have is with the worker, and so they're incredibly dependent, or would like to be incredibly dependent. We have mentally challenged clients that cannot understand why workers just can't be friends. And we have individuals whose cultural and family background does not make distinctions between personal and professional relationships. If we get along together, if I like being with you, if you help me, if it's clear from the point of view of the client that the worker is very involved in that, well, then aren't we friends? Aren't we friends? And trying to communicate that is difficult, because it's really a point of view or worldview, and that's just different. And so we're communicating across worldviews. And Rachel, I'm wondering if I do have some situations set up, but I'm wondering whether it would make sense to stop here, and if anybody wants to add in either what's problematic to them or what they've done in any of those kinds of three situations. And then let's see if some things will appear that we can talk about now.
Sure. If anybody has any of that feedback they'd like to offer, just type it into that question box, and we will monitor that and kind of share that. Everything will be anonymous, too. I know this is going to be a touchy situation, so don't feel like we're going to call you out by name. Nothing sent in yet, so
Let's give it 30 more seconds and then we'll continue and we can pick it up toward the end. Rachel, shall I continue?
Yep, nothing yet.
Okay. So there's the case of sequential relationship. And the question, if someone is once a client, are they always a client in terms of paying attention to dual and multiple relationships? And roles change and people change. And I think this is especially, I mean, what we know about poverty is that some people who are poor will kind of go in and out of poverty for big chunks of their life. And other people, and I think we've seen this especially coming out of the 2008 recession, of people who are doing fine and suddenly for the first time in their life they need to get help, and they get help, and then at some point a couple of things can happen. They can do well, they want to kind of give back, they end up serving on advisory boards, on other kinds of boards. They may become volunteers, or they may get employed in social services. And this has happened a lot related to homelessness and related to the kind of staff in shelters that might be second and third shift employees. And so the question is then, okay, so what's the relationship between the worker, somebody who's been a worker, and somebody who has been a client and now is in a different role? And there's not one answer, because a lot of it depends on personality. But I think from my point of view, the most important thing is that the worker does not acknowledge the former role. That in any kind of setting, if the person who has been a client wants to talk about that, and wants to really tell her or his story in terms of how they got there, and maybe acknowledging what your role was in helping them move to essentially a better place in their life, that's fine. But I don't think ethically and in terms of privacy, we can or should disclose that in any way, shape, or form. So to sum up the issue around about dual relationships, one is they're inherent, which means that they're just going to happen. In the work of all helping professionals, regardless of work setting or client population, that it may happen a lot, it may happen a little bit, it will happen less if you just moved to a community than if you grew up and went to school there and have lived there all your life, but it's still going to happen. Despite clinical, ethical, and legal risks, some blending of roles is unavoidable, and it's not necessarily unethical or unprofessional. But having said that, it's essential for professionals, it's essential for workers to recognize the potential for harm associated with any kind of blending of roles. Any time in which more than one role is in play, or the actions by a client tends to, in their mind, for them to think of you in multiple roles. And how you do that to protect the clients and yourself and Salvation Army, one is you just maintain healthy boundaries from the start. And you're just making sure you're clear what your role is. You discuss with clients both potential risks and the benefits of dual relationship or any kind of blending of roles. At some point it may be that issue of the mutual acquaintance, and you just may acknowledge, this is a little complicated, right? And the person says, right. And I said, okay. Is it getting in the way? No. All right. And so you remain willing to talk with clients about it, because within a private place, you can mention that it exists, so that the person who knows you went to school with brother and sister, and so if there was some point where that might become important, you say, this is a reality. I see your sister sometime. I don't talk to her about anything we do, right? Just so those kinds of things are clear. That you seek supervision. The last two of these are very important to resolve any dilemmas. When it becomes problematic, when the risk for harm is high, when you've got questions and you're not exactly sure, talk to supervisor, talk to the officer, talk to Rachel, talk to somebody and say, okay, I'm not sure what to do here. What should I do? And document any dual relationships in your case notes. And the advantage of having done that early on is that it means if anything were to come up, that you're not hiding anything. So we can come back and look at those, and I hope that there's some responses and questions when we get to some of those scenarios. But I want to go on and talk to something else that I think is really important in this day and age, and that's the issues with social media and newer technology as it relates to roles and as it relates to privacy. And one of those I want to start with is Facebook, because we think of Facebook and people use Facebook in different ways. That I know some I did not proof that well enough. That was supposed to say some nonprofits set up Facebook pages for a fundraising campaign or a community awareness event, or a community awareness effort. So it could be that there would be a wellness campaign going on in your community. It could be that there's a Coach for Kids or something else in which the Army's involved, in which there needs to be, there would be photographs, and there would be photographs of you on that, and so people would see that. And that's really different than a Facebook profile for personal purposes, one that you set up to share information with family and friends. And clients may not see the difference. Well, he's on Facebook, so I'm going to send a friend request. And I don't, and if you ignore my friend request, well, then you must not like me, right? Because it goes back to that issue of personalizing the situation. I have students who send me friend requests, and generally what I say is that after you graduate, I'll accept the friend request when you're no longer a student. But that's a dual relationship between being a student and even that very tenuous piece of being a Facebook friend, and we put friend in air quotes there. So clients may not see that. But the other thing is that even though clients may not know the differences, and we don't friend clients, the fact is if you've got a Facebook account, that all your photos are generally going to be public to everybody unless you go through some really complicated privacy settings to get that, to set that. And then Facebook keeps changing the privacy settings, and I think part of the reason they change the privacy settings is knowing that people just don't get around to doing that and making more and more information public. So so this isn't coming out. So everyone can see your photos. Oops, I'm sorry, let's go back. Everyone can see your photos. So be mindful about how much you want people to know about you. So this was a photo that I got from my Facebook page. And I use it mostly to keep in touch with acquaintances. I mean, the good friends I've got, you know, we're talking on the phone, we're emailing some, we're doing that. I think probably my two best friends are not on Facebook, and we communicate other ways. But so this was a photo that was taken in June of this year. Our son, who is the guy with some family resemblance in the middle of those 5 people, was graduating, and so my wife and daughter and I, and so those are the, so you see myself and my wife and my son and my daughter went out to California to help celebrate. One night we were at a Korean restaurant. It was my daughter's birthday. My wife had baked a cake. We had rented a short-term rental out there, and a friend of ours from back when my son and daughter and I used to do community theater, who's out there. So Deirdre, who's on the right, joined us. Okay, and that's from the parking lot of the Korean restaurant because they would not let us eat the birthday cake. So we took chopsticks and cut up the birthday cake and had a great time eating in the parking lot. Now, I put that on there because I don't mind sharing photos of my family. You know, I don't mind people knowing I've got, this is what my wife, this is my children. In some situations, and I think especially if you're working with individuals who have had contact with law enforcement, or people who are just really manipulative, you just don't want people to, you don't want people to have that information. And so one needs to be careful. I mean, often when one talks about Facebook, people will say, watch out for things that are embarrassing. And I'm not really worried about you guys posting that. But that issue about, do you want to have anything that is personal up there? Now, and I think that there are times in which Facebook can just be really valuable. I've got friends who are in their 30s with 2 really adorable children and big families on both sides. And I think about the time that that Johnny, who is 6, was born. Dave McGee, the dad, said, look, we're not going to send you pictures. If you want to see pictures of our kids, and we'll put a lot up, ask to be a Facebook friend, and we'll accept that friendship, and that's just the way we'll communicate. There are some advantages of that, but you lose privacy, and you especially lose some privacy if you've got a name that is fairly uncommon. So it's easy to find, it would be easy to find somebody. So here is one solution, and that is to put a Facebook page that's less findable. So in this picture from a Wisconsin football game earlier this fall is the person third from the left is my friend Nick. And about 4 years ago, Nick emailed and Facebook messaged people and said, okay, I'm taking down my my Facebook page. Partly because he's got a last name that's unusual. He said, but I just don't want the whole world to be able to see it. And what he did was he put a new name together with his initials. So assuming that somebody's name was Lawrence Connor Towns, then what we'd do, because I don't want to actually give the way Nick did it, but when the Lawrence Connors, you turn that into Elsie, E-L-C-E-E, E-L-C-I-E, and then T, T-E-E. And so there's a Facebook account under the name LCT, and spelled out in words rather than just the initials. And so the friends would go there and to do that, but nobody who Nick doesn't really want to see that would be able to see that photo or other photos, none of which are damaging, but it's a way to maintain privacy. In addition to Facebook, I think that we need to look at the implications of texting. Um, and the good news about texting, it's a very efficient way to communicate with, I say talk, but really communicate with clients or participants. In that Bethel House, in the nonprofit that I mentioned earlier, the case manager says that with one of the clients she's got, and this is a woman who suffers from is being treated for clinical depression, and sometimes just really slows down. And so Christy will say she will text her sometimes in the morning saying, "How are you doing?" And we'll get a response. Now this is a client that if Christy calls her, could talk for 45 minutes or an hour. And Christy said, I don't have the time to do that, but the texts seem to work. It lets her know that I'm concerned about her. It seems to kind of get her going. The difficulty with that is we generally associate texting, sending text messages with families and friends. And when everybody who texts a certain person who's a client of the Salvation Army is family or friends except the worker, well then does that mean that the worker now is in that group? So again, it's the blurry, it's that kind of gray area. So that's much of the content that I really wanted to talk about with you. But there are a number of scenarios, and I really want to kind of start with ones that are easier and then go to ones that are a little bit more difficult. So you're in an evening event at your child's elementary school, and you're seated with family and friends or neighbors. You're eating snacks and drinking punch, and a client waves at you from 2 tables over. What do you do? So I'm going to stop, and I think we'll get some probably responses to this one, Rachel.
Yep, so just type in your response if you'd like to share what you would do into the question box so we can share some of those with the group. All right, we have one response that says nod or give a small wave and continue doing what I was doing with my family.
And there may not be any more because that's essentially probably what I would think that pretty much everyone would say.
Yeah, now they're all coming in and all along that same
Good.
line.
Are they all the same?
Yep.
Are there any that are different?
One clarifies not to initiate more conversation. Some, say nod or smile, and kind of all along that same lines.
Right. What you want to do is to acknowledge it, but you don't really respond, and you don't initiate the conversation. Right. You don't really respond. You don't initiate conversation with someone. I found myself once. And actually, as I'm saying that, I'm trying to remember whether I actually did this or whether I was just kind of rehearsing it as something to do. Because one of the disadvantages of even the small nod is the person next to you saying, "Do you know that person?" And I think what I had set up for that was just saying, sometimes I don't know how I know people, and everybody will pretty much nod their head and agree with that because you run into someone and you think, I don't know how I know that. So essentially it was a true statement that didn't actually answer the question. But you were not lying, and it really protected that relationship. So here's another one. And this one is much tougher. Salvation Army employee and Salvationist wants to be involved with the Pathway of Hope program. What do you do?
All right, if you have an option to do what you would do in that situation, feel free to type that in and share.
Rachel, we getting any responses?
We have one that just states that the program is for clients and maybe not a good idea. Another response says, engage conversation with them about their desire to be in POH and then go from there, kind of seeing if they're truly interested. And then consult with their regional coordinator because they don't know if they should work with one of their colleagues in this program.
Okay. So given that the regional coordinator is on the line right now, correct?
Well, one of them.
One of them is.
There's many of us.
A regional coordinator. What would your response be, Rachel?
I think it would be very dependent on the individual location, what additional support is available, what type of supervision, and how maybe close of a colleague this is. And it would be a time to bring in the core officer and any additional case management or social service staff and see if it's even something that we can do plausibly, or if someone actually put this in, if there's another core that's close, maybe have them receive services there and kind of strategically plan based on that. Those could be really individual situations and they could go many different ways, so it's hard to say one right answer.
And in many of those things, there's no one right answer because it's complicated, you know, and it may be complicated by the person's desire. It may be complicated by, you know, they say it's an employee, but, you know, they're someone who is clearly not making enough money at what they're doing to where they're still, you know, on, they're really not making it, right?
We did actually encounter this here pretty early on. It was a custodian at one of the core. Their family was interested, and we were able to bring them into Pathway of Hope, and we just made sure that there was a lot of supervision, and the core officer was aware of things, and there was a lot of good communication and very careful about the boundaries and when things are being done. And it worked okay in that situation, but it's definitely something you can look at individually.
Right. Consult the officer, consult a regional coordinator. So here's another one. You're working off and on with a woman for a period of time. She's come in, she's got help, she's been okay, back and forth. She's been enrolled in a CNA training program and invites you to the graduation. Would you go?
All right, easy one. You guys can just type in yes or no even.
And you might as well say yes or no and why, right? So we'll make it a little less easy, right?
We have one that says no. One that says yes, especially if they had no family or other support system. One said no, but sent a card of congratulations from Pathway of Hope. One that says yes if it's in work hours and I can get away from the office to do so. And one that says yes because I play an important role in the situation and it's important to her. One that says yes as you want to be supportive. Another yes.
Okay. I think this is one of those situations where the communication is really important. You know, you get invited to the graduation and you talk with a person and you said, one, I feel honored that you want me to be there. I'm very proud of what you've done. And you realize that if I come, people are going to say, so who are you? You know, why are you here? Because many of the other people that are there at the graduation ceremony will know each other. And if the client is somebody who talks about her story, you know, and in some ways talks about how the Army or this program was helpful, it makes perfect sense. As long as the client is very aware of what could happen at that graduation ceremony, and in many cases maybe happy about that. But so I think this again goes back to that issue of making sure that the communication is clear. So here's a similar situation. You're working off and on with a woman for a period of time. She invites you to her daughter's quinceañera, the 15-year birthday party that in some Hispanic Latino communities is a really big deal. Would you go?
One first response that comes in says, depends if you know the daughter and what the relationship there is like. And someone else says, no, that's a situation for family and friends. Another one says, no, it's a social event and not connected to my work with the client. And one says, I would thank her but would have to say I cannot attend. Another, probably not, it seems too personal.
Yeah, and I think that's generally, and the response that say it's not connected to my work is, I think, the one that's important. The CNA was connected to the work. This really is a time for family and friends. And essentially, if you go, unless there may be a very special circumstance, but in generally it seems if you go, you're going to a social occasion in which everyone there really knows each other socially. And so in general, it would be that thing of thanking her and saying you're unable to attend, maybe sending a congratulations card to the daughter if you know the daughter. So here's another one that one of the participants there had suggested. You volunteer in another agency or church ministry where you help a client that you work with in your job. So how do you interact with the client? And then also, and this is the one that I added in, how is that different than helping a client in volunteering with another agency or church ministry that you had worked with 3 years earlier? So are there ways in which, how does the current or previous relationship impact your conversations or your communication with the client in your volunteer role?
Okay. One of them says, I would still greet them in a manner that lets them know I remember them, but will interact with them in a manner that reflects the current environment. A second response then says, I would go about as if they were another volunteer to avoid other people knowing that they were a client. I would treat the older client in the same way. Another one says, interact with them in a professional manner. I would keep the context of the conversation church-related. And another response says, as the worker, it is important not to disclose your previous relationship and move forward.
And I think that especially if there are situations if there are situations in which there's other people present, treating them as if you did not know them is perfect sense, because otherwise you're disclosing information. I think any time that you're in a volunteer role and you're working with someone that you see at the Army, you try to keep those as separate as possible, just completely separate as possible, and you certainly don't bring in the ways that you know that. I think it gets a little more complicated when you run into somebody that you helped a long time ago. So for 8 years, I volunteered at a free clinic in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, that the health department did. They did on Thursday afternoons, and it really was like the old TV show MASH. And essentially, lots of people would show up. It was all volunteer. Actually, there was one health department employee. Otherwise, all volunteer docs and nurses and lab techs. And I was one of the people who did intake, and I speak Spanish. And about 40% of the people were Spanish speaking, so in those situations they didn't need an interpreter. and I did some medical interpreting, although my knowledge of medical terms isn't as good as it should be. But when I was doing that, and so I think that was like from probably 98 to 2005, they changed, or actually it went a little later, they changed the format and it no longer was as much client contact. So I stopped volunteering because I was just sitting around a lot. But one of the times I was doing that, I ran into a woman that I had known when I did the social work role with the FAST program, Families and Schools Together, that Children's Service, now Children's Hospital of Wisconsin Community Services runs. And it was a family that I had met, and I actually was tutoring their son at my daughter's elementary school. And so she came in, and we were doing intake, and we were in the office, and I said, "How have you been?" Because it seemed like to not acknowledge that would be to not acknowledge that I knew her. So I tried to ask a question in as open a way as possible. I knew that there had been some difficulties in the family. And so I think, and that felt very much okay to me. There are times in that role when I had run across people that had been at Bethel House, and some of which I knew and some of whom I just knew about because I recognized their name. The coordinator worked with those, and in those cases I gave no indication that I knew who they were. Anything else anybody want to add to that before we move on? Okay, we've got just time for one last.
There was one more comment, sorry. It came in right as you stopped. This is a little different than what we are discussing currently, but what would you recommend in the situation of serving at a food or a pantry, and while clients with children are waiting to receive their food, approaching them to interact with their kids and introduce yourself with the intention of being possible Pathway of Hope client? Are you referring to a Salvation Army food pantry or an external service? Because like another agency, I think that changes the question.
I think it changes.
At a Salvation Army, so at a Salvation Army program.
Are you sending that back to the person who wrote it in?
Yep, she just responded back that it would be at a Salvation Army pantry. So while the clients are with children and are waiting to receive food, approaching them to interact with their kids and introduce yourself with the intention of being a possible Pathway of Hope client.
I agree with Rachel that it makes all the difference whether it's something for the Army. I think what you're doing is you're talking to the family, and you're really just talking about other resources that the Army has. And I think that's something that we should be doing, So I think the difficulty would be if there were 3 or 4 families and you singled out one family and only went to that one family. But if that's part of what one does while one is around there, I think that's very much okay, whether you interact with the children first or whether you just go up and introduce yourself. Rachel, we're almost out of time, but can I throw one more in?
Sure.
Okay, because this was somebody this was one that someone had mentioned, and I wanted to, and I thought it was important. So you've worked in the past with an individual with a work history of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, perhaps something that was more than that. You learn that he's applying to be a foster parent. Can you warn foster care agencies? So I'd like for people to respond to that.
One person responded, yes, I believe that falls under duty to warn. Someone else said, yes, duty to warn, however, agency should also do their background check. A few other people said, yes, they could be harmful to self or others, or they hope so.
The difficulty is that with this, and I think this very much is a gray area because we don't know that this is somebody who was a who is dangerous to children. We just don't know. I mean, it's not good. If it has not been reported, if it has not gone through anything, then you know they'll be doing the background check. But the question is, anything going to show up in the background check? You know, and I think that one of the so I don't know what I think it does fit under duty to warn, but the other thing is that duty to warn gets so much easier if there has been some documentation of that. And the difficulty often with sexual misconduct is that it doesn't get documented anywhere. And then there really is nothing to go back on, and there's just nothing to back up one if one's making that kind of allegation. So I think that in many cases, if we have notes in employees' files, if there are things that one can refer back to, it makes it much, much easier. I want to know if there were other instances or situations in which people would like to get some discussion or perspectives on.
We don't have anything coming in, so.
Okay, I'm trying to get back to this. Well, if that's the case, then thank all of you for coming today, and I will get that information to Rachel, and we'll be sending that out to you.
Yep, I will send a follow-up email with the link to the recording and any of the handouts and bibliography from Dr. Winship either tomorrow or maybe early next week. Depends how quick we are. Please fill out the quick feedback survey for us so we can make sure we have accurate attendance and feedback on the webinar process and things. And then otherwise, we are all done for the day. So thank you, everyone, for your participation and for typing in all those responses for the questions so we can have a little bit of interaction. So
Excellent.
have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and next week have a great Thanksgiving.